My name is Joseph Graham. I'm the author of Insatiable Hunger. I'm also the author of Naming the Laurentians, which was a book exploring the stories behind place names in the Laurentians. I always like to try to see the world from where I am. I live in the Laurentians between Montreal and Mont Tremblant.
Well, I'm so excited to do this with you, Joe. I'm so honored to actually have this conversation with you. My name is Rola Helou, and I'll be, I guess, the co-host of this discussion so that we can learn not only more about the book, but a little bit more about Joseph Graham.
I'm also very grateful to you, Rola, for accepting to do this interview with me because of your knowledge of governance and local Indigenous communities today.
So you've been writing about the Laurentians for some time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Started in the 60s, developed into a newsletter, into a regular news article in the local paper. Now, what motivated you to write this particular story, Insatiable Hunger? How did you go from naming the Laurentians to Insatiable Hunger?
I have to, I owe a certain amount of that to Serge Laurent wrote the Histoire des Laurentides.
Mm-hmm.
And in Serge Laurent's Histoire des Laurentides, he talked about the Wescarini, the Algonquin nation that, according to him, once lived here, but was massacred by the Mohawk, by the Five Nations in 1652, and only one old man and a child were left. And I thought, well, I was writing about Nominang at the time, and Nominang was one of the places, their important centers, according to the information I was finding. And I tried to reach out to Algonquin people to substantiate his story. And I have to say that I didn't know how to listen to Algonquin people at that point. I could not satisfy myself that anyone was telling me anything that would help me substantiate or deny the story of Serge Laurent. It was more, what they were saying to me was basically, shut up and think. I just wasn't sophisticated enough to get the answers they were giving me. So I left the story the way it had been printed already in the original. Once it was in the book, I got a very, very angry email from a woman who knew about the Wescarini because she was part Wescarine. And she scolded me for listening to the dead white author's kind of history and not doing proper research. She was absolutely dumbfounded when I got back to her and thanked her and asked for some help. We're still friends today. She was hugely helpful. And so that, coupled with the fact that at that time, Stephen Harper was trying to promote the War of 1812 as Canada's great victory in military victory. And I was thinking, I have a bit of work to do to find out what the devil's going on. And I came across a book by Bruce Trigger. Bruce Trigger is, he's not with us anymore, but he wrote a masterful history called The Children of Atensik. And it was the history of the, what we call the Huron. They called themselves the Wendat from up until 1650. It took me 2 years to read it. It's a college course book. It's very, very thick. It's very detailed. But it completely changed my thinking about the world around me. And I began looking at the different nations that had flourished here, how they were still here, how they were struggling. And well, you know much more about this than I do. Your background has involved you very deeply in Indigenous affairs. But it really helped me to understand what I was seeing and to start to expand upon it. Then realizing that the War of 1812 was an absolute disgrace, and that Harper should not be able to get away with it, I kept working.
So I mean, Harper hasn't been in power for quite a few years. So that means you've been working on this book for how many years, would you say?
Well, if I say I started with Patricia's email to me, I guess I've been working on it since then, because she sent me that. The first book came out in 2005, say 2008, 2009. She sent me that, so somewhere in there, 12 to 14 years. But I have to say that my gardens always took priority in the summer.
And that's quite a bit of work, because it's really you and Sheila working in the gardens, and occasionally some woofers, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. The woofers they're still. We stopped doing it with COVID. We stopped doing that, but we had so many that came over time that we have a network of friends around the world, which is fascinating, because especially when one of them got back to me and said, "My husband's reading your book." And I said, "But you're in Japan. How did you get it?" "Amazon Japan, 2 weeks."
That's incredible. It really is a small world, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating.
So in between, planting season and harvesting season, and, plucking the chicken season, you were able to find some time to continue to do what I'm hearing is quite extensive research. I mean, some of the stories that you tell in Insatiable Hunger, I've never heard of anywhere else than in your book. So you must have come across some pretty obscure references. Tell me a little bit about how you came to find these references.
Well, one leads to the other. When you find something, you look at its references, you see where those ideas came from. You get another book. If you find it, I ended up reading a huge number of books on the subject. Now, the subject, I have to say, extended way beyond Indigenous issues, in the sense that I wanted to know what happened to destabilize the Indigenous nations, the Indigenous civilization that was here. And, George Siwi was very helpful in his writings. Other places were a book that I found only online, which was really, really a revelation to me. It was the story of Admiral de Coligny in France. Now, Admiral de Coligny was a Huguenot, a French Protestant, who tried very hard to create a safe port for Huguenots in case the French became completely mad, which they were on their way to doing. And he tried. What astounded me in reading this thing, a PDF online, was he tried 4 times. First time in South America, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, rather, no, Georgia, Florida, Georgia, and then of course the Maritimes, and finally Quebec. But it wasn't him who did the last 2. He was killed by the French in wars of religion. And that was the revelation. What is this business of the wars of religion? I mean, I'd heard of it. I didn't know that much about it. But I discovered that Europe in the 1500s and 1600s was a cauldron of war. And that most of the people who fled to the Americas could be considered refugees from those religious wars. And they came here full of their convictions, their religious convictions, and blinded by their religious convictions, and completely incapable of seeing that they were visiting a highly developed civilization that far surpassed the ones they had abandoned. And this is what I kept seeing in reading, that these people they didn't have any even common ground, forget about language, to understand each other. And this became, as you can imagine, it obsessed me for years. So,
it's interesting, because that notion of differing worldviews is fundamental to understanding the First Peoples of this land. I think we have to recognize that our worldview as Canadians is fundamentally different from the worldviews presented from Indigenous perspectives. And one of the things I appreciated about your book, and I must say, Joe, and I apologize for this, but I'm not a big history buff. I'm not one to read history books in general, but what I really appreciated about the story that you told is how you weave between what was happening here on this continent as the Europeans arrived and were just discovering the first peoples that were here, as the first peoples were embracing the Europeans' arrival and supporting them, you know, in getting to understand this land and how it works. And then you take us across the ocean and tell us about what's happening, what's motivating those Europeans and how they're seeing what they're learning about here, and then how they're taking it back and then bringing it back. It's really a beautiful weave that you've created in the story. What motivated you to do it that way? Like, did it, as you started writing, did you say, I got to do it in this fashion to really show the story from both sides? How did you come up with that concept?
Yeah, I have to say, I wish that I had some vision to see it all as one piece. I didn't. And I realized that I was lost in the weeds. I had, basically, I felt I was writing 3 different books at the same time, and it just didn't make sense. I couldn't get my mind around the whole picture. I realized that I wanted to know what the Europeans did that was effectively so distressing and damage causing. But I ultimately could not write one of the ideas without using the others. And Sheila, who's always been sort of, as you know, my guide, said I needed a structural editor. So I contacted a structural editor, and it's amazing how these things happen. In between the time I contacted her and when we started working together, I suddenly began to see the whole thing's coming together as one story. And so I started talking with her, is it possible to do it this way? And she said, I can't see any better way of doing it. And she was really helpful in encouraging me and giving me the confidence to look at it that way. When she read it, she said, the manuscript, she said, Joe, I have 2 comments. One is it's way too long. Then it was way, way longer. And 2, you got to get rid of that anger. Mm. She said, it's just too offensive. The anger has got to be softened somehow. Simultaneously, I discovered another book, and this is a book that I think, I have to say, changed my whole way of thinking. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it is also a weave. And have you read it yourself? It's just
that's a beautiful book.
It's beautiful, and there's no anger in it. She pulls no punches, and there's no anger. And I said, well, she has much more business being angry than I do. So I have to find out, I have to deal with my anger. My anger was basically, I grew up a Catholic. Until I was 16, I had an altar on my dresser. I said my prayers every night. I was going to be a priest. That was my understanding about my future. And then one night I wrote a prayer. I said my prayers. I got to bed. And the next morning I woke up. I dismantled the altar, put it in boxes, got rid of it, and wrote a really angry poem that just didn't see any point in God or the church. And then I went through a period of not being able to sleep over this whole thing because it changed everything. It meant that I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. And I began to realize that I had to examine that. And that's where my real research began, into where did this idea of a single God come from, for instance? Like I was trying to express it. I was talking with my grandson about believing in God. You don't have to believe in gravity to keep yourself from falling down or drifting away. You shouldn't have to believe in God. There's something wrong with that. And then I came upon some research, which all of this is in the book, by Anki Becker, who was a Harvard researcher who had done an analysis that she called herding and male dominance. She was trying to figure out where male dominance came from, trying to show it through, and she found through the herding culture a very strong tendency to see herding and male dominance as being feeding each other. And I read her study, and I discovered in the course of it that there was several areas in the world that never did herding, or to any real degree. And the major one was South and North America. In South America, they had a little bit of herding, but generally herding was not a factor. And I thought that's really interesting because it means that the herding has to be responsible for the male-dominated hierarchies that have caused us, created religion for us as we know it, created the single God, and so on. And in this culture, they didn't have any of those things. That was a big connector for me. So I explored it, I wrote it, it's in the book.
Well, that's, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, after you.
Well, I was just going to say that that's one of the incredible things about the book is you explore so many different notions, if you will, and then you tie them all into your main message, which of course I don't want us to reveal necessarily, but I think people should read the book. But there is an underlying message, and that's, I think, where the title came from. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's funny, yeah. The Insatiable Hunger just came to me as a title, and I was glad that the publisher accepted it because I didn't know if it would work. A number of talks I gave about it, this more sort of explains it. Small talks. One talk, I asked this friend, he said, I really liked your book. And I said, well, can you come to the talk and ask me questions so that they can be, other people can hear them. And he asked me a bunch of questions, but in the course of it, he said, your book, Insatiable Greed. And I thought that was really interesting. And a number of other people remember the title as Insatiable Greed. Well, the Insatiable Greed was a contrast to the Indigenous culture, which is a culture of sharing. And you think this Christian culture comes to a new world, a different world, where there's a civilization whose fundamental ethic is sharing. And the Christians, these sharing people, look at the Christians and realize that they don't know how to share. And that fundamental ethic of sharing is in such contrast to the hierarchical culture in Europe that made me realize that the hierarchical culture was a consuming culture. It had to consume everything in its path. And therefore, the Indigenous people could not trust it, but it always took a bit too long to see the dangers. Their ethic was to share. These people were arriving on their shores, males only, usually stinky, dirty, starving, not looking like, also much smaller, people who looked like they really needed love. And they reached out to them and shared with them, only to discover that they turned out to be an insatiable monster. So that's where the title came from.
That's really, I think, a nice kind of bow to the story, because it really is the underlying kind of theme. For me, it really made it clear as to why the weaving was necessary, because we needed to understand how things were happening here and how things were happening in Europe, and how the two came together ultimately to lead to the destruction, unfortunately, of the Indigenous peoples that were here, and to lead to this ongoing patriarchal capital world that we still live in, unless you have a farm up in a little log cabin in the Laurentians, in which case you kind of, you just sow what you need to eat for you and your family. That's
basically it. But let me just go back for a second,
Sure.
Because as well as I do, we have a tendency to say it, but it's not true. It was not that they were weakened, but they were not destroyed, as you know, and they are strong, and they are our only salvation. We have waited 500 years, but it's time to start listening to them, and really listening to them. And I think that I don't mind saying what's in the book, because I think that people who value the book will read it anyway. But that's basically the message: is we have to listen.
It is time, absolutely. And you said it yourself, when you when you started using the Three Sisters technique in your garden, you were really able to not just restore the earth, but bring it to life and allow you to bring in more vegetables. And I think that's the same message, right, in the book, is we need to go back to those principles, right? The principles that the Indigenous people were trying to share, or did share, but the Europeans weren't able to listen, and bring back those ways so that we can restore the earth, both figuratively and literally.
Yeah, there's so much, and the call is for all of us to work at it and try to figure it out, because no one person has the answer. Obviously, we all have to work for that answer, and the Indigenous people are struggling to validate what they know and what they learn and to share it, and they're still as sharing as they ever were, and that's the remarkable thing. They're still there. There's still a possibility. I'm not saying everybody, but it's never true. You can't say anything is true of everybody. But there are those who really understand this and are working hard towards it.
Well, there certainly is a movement, and we know that there are several groups that are working with Indigenous groups to kind of bring those important notions back. And hopefully each of us, when we read your book, will reflect on these important notions and see how we can make changes in our own lives to not be consumed by the insatiable hunger.
Yeah, and I don't dare, one of the things that I talk a little bit about in the book is, well, two of them, Adodaro and the Wendigo. And these are the two cultures that I really work with are the Algonquian and the Iroquoian, not beyond that, because North America is rich with culture and there's only so much territory. But those two messages seem to me like the messages of to be wary of insatiable hunger.
Any last thoughts, Joe? Anybody wanting to pick up your book? What are some last thoughts in closing?
Well, I look forward. I didn't write this book for money. You don't write books for money, but I did write it to share and to want to share. So if people want to reach out to me, book clubs, whatever, I'm very happy to pursue that. I think we have a lot of work to do, and the work can be joyous, as we saw in Braiding Sweetgrass in Robin Kimmerer's book. So we can work together, and we can celebrate the solutions together, and feel the joy of that we have been missing.
Joseph, thank you so much for taking some time to discuss Insatiable Hunger. And if people do want to reach out, if they want to read your book and have you come in and answer some questions, how do they reach you?
I think the simplest way is just to go to my website at insatiablehunger.ca. In any case, I think there's going to be something at the end of the video, isn't there, for that kind of information? Anyway, Rola, thank you very much. This has been a real pleasure, and I look forward to the next time we do something like this.
Thank you, Joe.